Hey everybody, this is a piece titled Finite Marxism by Frieder Otto Wolff. This is from Marx Key Concepts, edited by Riccardo Bellofiore and Tommaso Redolfi Riva. In order to advance a double goal of improving Marxist contributions to critical science and Marxist contributions to emancipatory politics, in this chapter I refer back to Althusser's little-known 1978 essay, Marxism as a Finite Theory, especially linking his problematics of a finite theory to the Marxian topic of the, quote, limits of dialectical presentation, end quote. On this basis, I propose the notions of a finite project and a finite initiative as a starting point for rethinking, quote, Marxist politics, end quote, and for establishing the groundwork for a Marxian philosophy which is capable of articulating an idea of, quote, finite plurality, end quote, as an attractive alternative to the notion of a, quote, monist infinity, end quote, monist infinity, as well as to that of a, quote, anything goes infinity, end quote. Section 1. A problematic alternative in the debate of the limits of dialectical presentation in Capital. Althusser hints about Marxism as a finite theory. Althusser's hints about Marxism as a finite theory have directed attention to the task of clearly defining our perspectives on the notion of, quote, materialist dialectics, end quote, which has been central for traditional conceptions of Marxism. Footnote. Where the French playful ambiguity should not be overheard as, quote, Marxism fini designates a, quote, finished and a, quote, finite Marxism. Also in English, at least, quote, infinite, end quote, may be understood as, quote, unending, end quote, so that talking about, quote, finite Marxism, end quote, seems to conjure up some sinister or promising, quote, ending, end quote, of Marxism. I am convinced that the contrary is true, quote, finite Marxism, end quote, in addressing specific problematics such as the domination of the capitalist mode of production in modern bourgeois societies, and the way modern politics have been reclaimed so far by the modern state, is indeed breaking the limits in which the postulated, quote, infinite, end quote, character of, quote, diamat, cum, quote, histomat, end quote, or its Hegelianized alternatives, had in effect enclosed historical Marxism since the 1920s, looking into the mathematical debates about, quote, infinities, end quote, especially Lorentz in 1957, will certainly be helpful to overcome the red herring of the traditional idea of a, quote, absolute infinite, end quote, supposed to be beyond the grasp of human reason, end footnote. Let me go back to what we were just saying, end footnote. Althusser's hints about Marxism as a finite theory have directed attention to the task of clearly defining our perspectives on the notion of, quote, materialist dialectics, end quote, which has been central for traditional conceptions of Marxism. Can we consider it as a kind of theoretical a priori, or do we have to understand it as an abandoned project? That is, which Marx has found compelled to drop with his advances in the investigation of, quote, modern bourgeois societies, end quote. I defend the thesis that this alternative is a false one and has to be rejected, and that the, quote, contradicting answer, end quote, to this, quote, false question, end quote, can largely be clarified by reading Marx's Capital. In Marx's Capital, Marx, in the very practice of his theoretical presentation, has fully attended to the finite character of his, quote, critique of political economy, end quote, that is, his critical theory of the domination of the capitalist mode of production, as the capitalist mode of production is realized in, quote, modern bourgeois societies, end quote, by, in fact, strictly observing the, quote, limits of dialectical presentation, end quote, as they are determined by this finite character, although only partly making them explicit. This can be concretized and verified by looking closely at the main examples occurring already in Capital Volume 1. The money commodity, labor power as a commodity, landed property, which all have to be taken up as a contingent, quote, given, which, as such, cannot be, quote, derived, from the preceding determinations as any idealist version of dialectics would have to do. Footnote. I propose to read Marx's distinction between the, quote, process of inquiry and the, quote, process of presentation, end quote, not as a literary device, but as an important methodological distinction between the process of scientific discovery and the process of scientific theory building. See Kuruma, 1969. I'd like to read some things by Kuruma. He's very... the things I have read from him have been very good. I just haven't made any audiobooks of them. End footnote. To sum up a long-winded and complicated debate, the following thesis may be formulated. As a materialist dialectics, Marx's method of presentation in Capital operates on the basis of the historical givenness of the conditions and presuppositions under which it operates, without submitting to the idealistic temptation of a totalizing closure of the cycle of reproduction of the domination of the capitalist mode of production. This acceptance of the, quote, finitude, end quote, of its objects of scientific inquiry does not imply a closure concerning the specific infinities of human cultural practice or human reflection, which, however, are not to be confused with processes of scientific discovery. Section 2. A radically materialist notion of method, materialist dialectics as an emerging project. On this basis, a radically materialist notion of dialectics may be developed as a, quote, method of presentation, end quote, which may not be unduly applied to the procedures and practices of research, as these are contingent on the really existing structures of the objects under inquiry, as well as on occasions and capabilities of inquiry, or on given prejudices and preconceptions, or on accepted presuppositions, on the part of the subjects of inquiry. This is, on the state of the development of the respective fields of science, as well as on the prejudices existing in the community of such subjects. Such a materialist notion of, quote, dialectics, end quote, will indicate and reflect the need for supplementing and, quote, underpinning, end quote, the scientific work of theoretical construction by properly taking account of historical and empirical facts as an unavoidable given. And it will, likewise, make it possible adequately to construct central concepts for deliberating in debates on strategy and tactics, such as notions of the, quote, finite projects and, quote, finite initiatives, end quote. There's a couple different footnotes here. First footnote, Marx could serve as a prime example of these problematics. In contradistinction to his British and French colleagues, Marx could not relate immediately to the established structures of modernity, but he had to, quote, work himself out, end quote, of the attempts by Hegel and Feuerbach to develop a modern perspective in and out of the retrograde, quote, German situation, end quote. End footnote. New footnote, which should be distinguished from psychological subjects, end quote, which, of course, do provide the unavoidable basis of their scientific activities of research and their theory construction. End footnote. Another footnote. The strong distinction between these two dimensions of planning was one's activity has been especially elaborated by Clausewitz. End footnote. In such a perspective of materialist dialectics, all claims to universalizing of transcendental positions or to articulating the point of view of an effectively all-embracing totality have to be critically rejected. Footnote. This presupposes that it is possible, following Althusser, to establish a tenable distinction between the Hegelian, quote, totality and the Marxian, quote, whole, which is certainly more complicated than Althusser's first indications seem to assume. I take it to be possible, even keeping in mind Hegel's often non-deductivist practice of his dialectics, by insisting on the unexhaustible material, quote, givenness, end quote, of the fields of inquiry in Marx's practice of research, which can be neatly marked off from Hegel's dialectics of the, quote, forms of consciousness, end quote. End footnote. Or in other words, in this methodological perspective, the specific objects, stakes, and perspectives of, for example, wage struggles, gender struggles, environmental struggles, in terms of struggles within ongoing reproduction processes, or, which is hard to distinguish but highly important, of struggles opening up into transformation processes of the existing structures of domination, will have to be specifically reconstructed in order to develop adequate criteria for orienting the practices of social movements, civil society organizations, trade unions, political organizations, or political parties towards a strategically adequate radicalization of their struggles. 2 footnotes here. First footnote. That this is really difficult to distinguish in actual practice provides an explanation for the widespread resistance against Lenin's insistence on this distinction, which, however, remains central to any kind of real efficacy of political action. End footnote. New footnote. The adequacy of such criterion cannot be judged on the basis of scientific findings alone, due to the structural incapacity of scientific analysis or even to analyze the very, quote, present moment, end quote, or the, quote, actual situation, end quote, which always opens to a specific future in which any action has to take place. In order to bring such a future about, there is an unavoidable intuitive element, presumably based upon actual practical, quote, experience in a very broad sense, as well as an element of choice in real judgments which, quote, about, quote, what is to be done, end quote. If this is properly reflected, it brings us to a position which overcomes the exaggerated rationalism of Lenin implicit in his combination of a totally justified insistence upon the, quote, concrete analysis of the concrete situation, end quote, as the imprescindible condition of rational political action, with the naive assumption that, quote, scientific research could ever reach it as its, quote, highest point, end quote, and B, also the subjects of practice could, quote, digest, end quote, the results of scientific research, quote, just in time, end quote, without giving into the open irrationalism professed by, quote, decisionism, end quote, as propagated by Carl Schmitt, which glories itself on the very unfoundedness of the resolutions to action which it propagates. End footnote. This should not be misunderstood to imply that subjective motives triggered by the, quote, contradictions, end quote, we have to live in, that is, the real antagonisms which determine our lives and which make us resist or rebel, such as suffering, indignation, or solidarity, would not and should not have an important role in the building of common motivations for action. It rather serves to indicate the requirements for developing rationally justified courses of action, tactics, or strategies. This kind of radically materialist notion of dialectics can help us to fully understand the contradictory, that is, antagonistically determined character of all these organizations and institutions. On the one hand, they are, without any possibility to avoid this and without any exceptions, spaces of struggle, where domination meets resistance and where moments of liberation are conquered. On the other hand, they always, with the exception of successful, quote, processes of revolution, end quote, tend to reproduce the domination of the dominating forces, even with some unavoidable transformations of the very structures and processes of their domination. By stressing an underlying structural dynamics and, quote, laws of development, end quote, of these struggles, finite Marxism, as I defend finite Marxism, takes finite Marxism's critical distance from all kinds of empiricism, limiting scientific inquiry to a description of empirical findings, and clearly articulates the efficacy of these structures and laws within specific historical processes as they can indeed be described on the basis of lived experience, without falling into the idealist mistake of reducing the complexity of the overdetermined and contingently materialized real processes to their generalizable structures. Accordingly, finite Marxism cannot fall back upon a general theory of society which has been made use of to function as a shortcut, avoiding the specific analysis of historically given societies. Footnote. As classically elaborated by the founding fathers of sociology, Durkheim, Weber, and Parsons. And another footnote, a lot of general talk about capitalism in general falls into that category. End footnote. And therefore, for finite Marxism, there is no way of avoiding the effort of either properly taking up relevant empirical findings or of critically establishing the theoretically determined structures capable of explaining the situation and trends found by empirical or historical research. Footnote. In doing so, it can and should be measured by the achievements of critical action research, as exemplified in recent German history by Willy Puller's conception of the, quote, social conflict as the main aspect of sociological research on industrial relation, end quote, which went beyond contemporary, quote, contemporary liberal, quote, theories of conflict, end quote, as Dahrendorf, Kosser, and critically Krismansky, and competed rather successfully with the then contemporary research on industrial relations carried out in the, quote, Frankfurt School, end quote, which had been developing in a Marxian horizon. Let's see if my internet works enough to get up a Willy Puller in some time, in consistent time, or because I'm outside, the internet's not working great. Willy Puller's underlying theses, which can be traced back to Simmel, especially that social conflicts are not always already decided in advance and tend to build societal structures anew while reproducing societal structures, constitute an important challenge to a finite Marxism working to make visible the materialist dialectics of the processes of class struggle inherent in the very reproduction of the structures of modern bourgeois societies, and to the Marxist claim to produce a kind of knowledge that may be used by the very subjects of class struggle to analyze the specific historical conditions under which they are operating. The intimate relation to Marxism emerges very clearly in an unfinished and unpublished study by Puller, where Puller attempted to show in which way the, quote, grand sociologies, end quote, of Weber, Simmel, and Parsons have all failed to fully take up the challenge of Marxist theorizing the domination of the capitalist mode of production in modern bourgeois societies, going so far as to attempt to take up central reflections of Mao Zedong on the conditions of social inquiry. Very probably opposed book worship from 1930, as well as on the relation between knowledge and practice, between knowing and doing from 1937, as well as a group of contemporary Czech Marxists, very probably Klofak and Klutzy. Bracket. I have to thank Helmut Martens, especially Martens 1994, his contribution to the Puller Festschrift, for his information about a manuscript which apparently had got lost in the library of the Sozialforschungsstelle Dortmund, at Dortmund, which I hope will be found again somewhere, end bracket. End footnote. And it becomes clearly visible that taking stock of the actual situation in which action or inaction is called for is a radically different procedure from summing up the, quote, state of the debate, end quote, of the relevant sciences. New section, section 3. The difference from postmodern Marxism. In order to avoid a number of misunderstandings about the approach of finite Marxism as I defend it, which otherwise quite patently are likely to arise, I now critically discuss the project of, quote, postmodern materialism, end quote, briefly discussing some epistemological/methodological key points as articulated in its programmatic publications, such as Colari and Ruscio, 1996, Resnick and Wolff, as in Richard Wolff, 2006. I have taken the liberty of summing up the key positions of this postmodern materialism in the following theses, which I shall comment upon one by one. 1. The concept of, quote, contradiction, end quote, is used to designate the diversity, differences, and conflicts which characterize the constitution of each aspect of the social totality. This is also true to some degree, of course, for the project of, quote, finite Marxism, end quote. However, the totalizing and in some way, quote, ontological, end quote, assumption that these conflicts characterize the constitution of each aspect of the social totality is not taken up for two reasons. One, that the very concept of the social totality should be problematized. Two, it is an unfounded ontological assumption that this applies to the constitution of each aspect of the social totality. Some aspects may not be characterized by such diversity, differences, and conflicts. It does, of course, make sense to talk about a given, quote, societal formation, end quote, Gesellschaftsformation, quote, as a whole, end quote. But this does not justify applying the Hegelian concept of, quote, totality, end quote, as the social totality may very well remain heterogeneous and impossible to reconcile in all its constitutive parts and dynamics. 2. The concept of, quote, overdetermination, end quote, is used to designate the complex constitution of each aspect / process of all the others, by all the others. This is again criticized by, quote, finite Marxism, end quote, as overly totalizing. Practical experience and scientific research are needed in order to be able to distinguish between those aspects and processes of societal relation which are constituted mutually, although possibly with very different impacts upon each other, and those which are not, that is, those which are not totally, quote, overdetermined, end quote, in this sense, as they are part of the external conditions and presuppositions of the existing complex structure of processes. 3. Thinking / theory is understood as a part of this social totality as a larger whole. This is, of course, fully shared by, quote, finite Marxism, end quote, with the precautionary caveats. However, that one, as just remarked, the whole of a given, quote, societal formation, end quote, is not a, quote, totality, end quote. And two, at least scientific thinking or theory is a very specific part of the respectively given social whole. For example, distinguished from ideology by the epistemological breakthroughs it realizes, as well as by the kind of ascertained and reliable, though, quote, relative, end quote, truths it produces. 4. Each overdetermined theory has that overdetermined theory's own notions of proof and truth, hence the rejection of notions of, quote, absolute truths, end quote. Footnote. This is a common argument in the German tradition of critical theory since Horkheimer's comprehensive discussion of the notion of truth. See Horkheimer 1935 and more recently E.G. Alfred Schmidt 1977. And footnote. For, quote, finite Marxism, end quote, overdetermination is not predicated on theories but on real structures, as real structures are articulated or, quote, captured, end quote, by theories. Therefore, the notions of proof and truth, insofar as they are, indeed, specifically used within given theoretical fields in order to address the respective fields of reality, are not only determined by or within these respective theories, they always relate back to a layer of more general notions concerning the constitutive differences of scientific inquiry and of scientific findings. The rejection of, quote, absolute truths, end quote, does not, therefore, necessarily lead to the hyper-relativism articulated in this thesis. Thesis 5. Contradictions constituted in the thinking process appear as opposed theories and as inconsistencies within theories. This is indeed a key issue and a real difficult one. We are convinced, however, that the problem of the foundations in reality, fundamentum in re, as the scholastics have expressed it, cannot be eliminated by just looking at theories. Even there, the issue of their relation to reality seems unavoidable at the very least when theory has to be applied to practice, as we tend to assume that the ways in which contradictions appear within theories are rather more variegated, also including, for example, blockades of thinking, imaginary, quote, experiences, end quote, never had, or, quote, evidence, end quote, never put into question. Thesis 6. The centrality of overdetermination rules out any notion that any social aspect, such as the economic, can be ultimately determinant of other social aspects. This is certainly also true in the perspective of, quote, finite Marxism, end quote. And yet, although the, quote, lonely hour of the last instance never tolls, end quote, Althusser and Eliot, there are relevant distinctions to be made between, for example, the material process of reproduction of a given society and the way it is reflected and justified within the dominant ideologies. This has been expressed by Engels using the metaphor of the difference of weight existing between the diverse, quote, factors, end quote, of societal reality. None of them is excluded from impacting upon the overall result of historical social processes. Processes. But the impact of some does take place more often and has a stronger weight in determining the specific outcome of such, quote, encounters, end quote. Likewise, it must be understood that there is no total autonomy of these various, quote, social aspects, end quote. While indeed each of them works according to its own rules within its given field of action, they are all, in parallel, quote, overdetermined, end quote, by some other fields working at the same time, although not all by all. Thesis 7. Marxist theory deploys Marxist theory's specific concepts of overdetermination, contradiction, and class as Marxist theory's distinctive basis for making sense of the social totality, for constructing its particular version of the concrete totality. The specific concepts named are taken up for the Althusserian reconstruction of Marxist philosophy, which of course is not an objection, as Marx has not articulated a fully fledged version of his philosophy accompanying his, quote, science, that is, the, quote, unfinished project of the critique of political economy, and a still more unfinished, merely incohative critique of politics, as it has been plausibly argued by Bellofiore et al. 1979, which of course does not constitute any objection from my part, as the, quote, finite Marxism, end quote, I am advocating takes that finite Marxism's bearings largely from the same source. It should only be underlined that this is a specific approach within Marxism which has had, quote, competitors, end quote, that should not be overlooked, such as the early critical lines within Soviet Marxism, such as Bukharin, de Borin, Ryazanov, Rubinstein, Varga, and Pashukanis, the, quote, critical theory, end quote, of Horkheimer, Adorno, and the Frankfurt School, or the Italian currents of Marxism looking back to Antonio Gramsci. Footnote. These currents are certainly not yet critically worked upon nor, quote, sublated, end quote, by Althusser's important philosophical initiatives in the late 1950s and in the 1960s. End footnote. The main problem, however, with this formulation lies, in my eyes, in the lack of clarity concerning, quote, social totality, end quote, and, quote, concrete totality, end quote. Even the capitalist mode of production in the capitalist mode of production's, quote, ideal average, end quote, is certainly to be no, quote, closed totality, end quote. And the social formations dominated by it cannot be understood as, quote, concrete totalities, end quote, if we really take into account their overdetermined and therefore also fragmented character. And maybe it should be underlined that Marx's theoretical reconstruction of the domination of the capitalist mode of production in modern bourgeois society does more than just, quote, make sense, end quote, of them. Excuse me. Where am I? It explains its contradictory, quote, general tendencies, end quote, and it grasps their underlying structures by constructing a conceptual framework while at the same time marking the limitations of this theoretical reconstruction. Section 8. Thesis 8. Marxian theory does not need, nor can Marxian theory sustain, any claim that Marxian theories, particular theories, grasp the essence or the truth of the social totality of reality. Again, this is, in one sense, fully shared by, quote, finite Marxism, end quote. Science, politics, and philosophy do not produce, quote, absolute truths, end quote. The traditional practice of, quote, essentialism, end quote, in this sense, as has also been widespread and current within the Marxist tradition, certainly has to be overcome. However, this does not imply dropping the category of truth from the practices of science, politics, or philosophy. On the contrary, the verification and falsification processes within scientific practice have to be consciously cultivated. The, quote, truth politics, end quote, characteristic of philosophy, and the truth claims raised within politics, as in the claim to make a, quote, true life, end quote, possible, have to be properly met instead of dropped. And as already indicated, the, quote, social totality of reality, end quote, seems to be a rather underdetermined, unclear, and even misleading category, which helps to maintain the illusion that knowing about all the scientific findings available for a given situation is sufficient to grasp what is at stake and what is really possible in a given situation of action. Practiced in this way, Marxist analysis of a given situation of action will be no less misleading than the dogmatic assertions of theoretical Stalinism. Footnote, which were, quote, held together, end quote, by the conviction that, quote, the leader, end quote, was always right. In, quote, postmodern, end quote, Marxism, this is indeed overcome at the price, however, of lapsing into open subjective arbitrariness. End footnote. Section 4. An alternative to postmodernism as well as to traditional Marxism. I shall now sketch my own position in two moves, first by referring back to the implicit method of Marx's Capital, and then by elaborating a distinction between the finitude of the sciences and the rational infinity even of Marxist philosophy. New section. This is like a subsection. The, quote, analytic, end quote, beginning of Capital, the book, and the, quote, limits of dialectical presentation, end quote, in its, quote, synthetic, end quote, line of argument. In contrast to the procedure proposed by, quote, postmodern, end quote, Marxism, I propose to reread Capital, where Marx has presented his method of presentation in its most elaborate and most developed form. Footnote, the most recent reconstruction by Stefano Breda. End footnote. It is often overlooked, in spite of a rather explicit remark by Marx, that Capital is not at all built upon the kind of circular argument underlying Hegel's logic. Not only does the first chapter present a, quote, analytic, end quote, argument, which in the end produces the concept of value as the starting point of the, quote, synthetic, end quote, development of the concept of, quote, capital, end quote, which occupies the rest of the book. But furthermore, the, quote, dialectical development, end quote, that Marx gives of his theoretical concepts by exposing them systematically is consciously interrupted at a number of points, where Marx consciously and carefully respects what he has called the, quote, limits of dialectical presentation, end quote, by introducing historico-empirical reconstructions, for example, of the rise of gold and silver to the role of, quote, the money commodity, end quote, of the availability of labor power for wage labor or of land use, as an example of, quote, ecological exploitation, end quote. An explicit comprehension of both movements in Marx's argument, that is, the analytic and the synthetic taken together, allows us to fully understand and reconstruct the way in which Marx's systematic science of the reproduction of the domination of the capitalist mode of production in modern bourgeois societies in its, quote, ideal average, end quote. A process of reproduction which in this very process tends to produce, quote, occasions, end quote, for its revolutionary overcoming, is capable of reconstructing the forms and the, quote, laws of motion, end quote, of this process as it underlines modern history until today. In doing so, Marx has taken the everyday notion of the, quote, wealth, end quote, of modern bourgeois societies, as it has served as the title notion of Adam Smith's classical work, for Marx's analytical argument in, quote, finding, end quote, the key concept for his further theoretical, quote, synthetical, end quote, reconstruction of the capitalist mode of production, that is, the concept of value, and I take this to give the key to Marx's fully developed understanding of the relation of this new science of the critique of political economy to experience. In contradistinction to Hegel, who attempts to reconstruct, quote, the experience of consciousness, end quote, Marx refers back to the practical experience of living in the modern world, in which indeed, quote, the wealth of societies, end quote, appears in the form of a collection of commodities on offer in the market, and this starting point is evident from lived experience to each and every one. Marx's, quote, construction of the concept, end quote, does not start with this, quote, wealth, end quote, or with the single, quote, commodities, end quote, by which it is constituted, but with the concept of, quote, value, end quote, which results from his analysis of the form of the commodity as a, quote, use value, end quote, bearing a, quote, exchange value, end quote. And this is then the starting point of Marx's synthetic, quote, development of the concept, end quote, which is Marx's Hegelianizing way of referring to the exposition of his theory. This reliance upon historical everyday experiences underlies Marx's presentation of his analytical move in the first chapter of Capital has nothing to do with any reliance upon individual subjectivity. It is based upon collective shared experiences which cannot be reduced to, quote, sense experience, end quote, but has to be understood in their given complexity. Or as, for example, Josiah Royce has put it in a perspective of pragmatism, quote, truth and falsity are indeed relative to insight, to experience, to life, to action, to the constructions which pragmatism emphasizes, but unless these constructions are what they ought to be, they are not true, end quote. I don't have the internet out here, so I can't look up who Josiah Royce is. In the comparable perspective to be constructed to articulate Marx's, quote, method of presentation, end quote, which is the way of proving the truth of his theory relying on experience, has nothing to do with, quote, methodological individualism, end quote, or with empiricism. Accordingly, the Marxian distinction between, quote, presentation and, quote, research lays the ground for Marx's most significant self-reflective category, for that of the limits, quote, limits of dialectical presentation, end quote. These limits stabilize the mediating process, making it impossible for it to vanish entirely, and thereby very clearly demarcate Marx's from Hegel's dialectics. In Marx we find theoretical objects which cannot be fully constructed by the dialectical, quote, order of presentation, end quote, of his own systematic theory, and which therefore have to be introduced into it in a different way. I contend that this also means that they cannot be fully reproduced in practice by the capitalist mode of production without the current complicity of something else, of some, quote, other, end quote, of the capitalist mode of production. Such objects include money as the specific value commodity, the wage labor as a key object of Marx's theory, and the social relation of landowners to pieces of the planet Earth. Their very existence has at least one important implication, whereas in Hegel it is at least possible to mistake the, quote, development of the concept, end quote, Entwicklung des Begriffs, for an a priori process due to its coinciding with the very process of articulating reality. This is no longer possible in Marx, where the, quote, dialectical presentation, end quote, can only begin in time after the process of research has been basically completed. And by bearing the marks of the double requirement of finding an analytical path to the elementary category of the capitalist mode of production, the category of value, and of respecting the materially defined, quote, limits of dialectical presentation, end quote, within its very, quote, presentation, end quote, as scientific theory, which at certain points ceases to be, quote, dialectical, end quote, in order to become merely historical about contingent facts. Marx's dialectics present themselves as being situated, finite, and irreversible, like real human practice in space and time. This insight opens a specific space for a controlled and conscious renewal of materialist dialectics, which definitely puts an end to make use of the excuse of, quote, dialectics, end quote, for covering up authoritarian manipulation or woolly thinking, and should and can effectively proceed on the following main lines. Full recognition of the post-Fregean formal, quote, mathematical, end quote, logics, making use of structural dynamics of theorization as allowed by formal logic, without attempting to substitute it, addressing fields of reality to be theoretically articulated in scientific inquiry, especially, quote, structures with dominance, end quote, singularities, and, quote, concrete situations, end quote. Addressing the reality of historical antagonisms, their possible mediations, and their solutions without any guarantee. Theoretically reconstructed historical relations of domination within given fields which form articulated wholes. Accumulation of capital, gender relations, international relations of dependency, and ecologies of humankind on all of its levels. Weighing the constellations of overdetermination in given, quote, concrete, end quote, situations is in the writing of history concerning the past or in the anticipation of possible futures, politics, consultative forecasting. Interventions by a radical way of philosophizing understood as an argumentative struggle within a politics of truth, following and applying the principle of admitting and talking to each and every one, the principle of inquiry prior to judgment, the principle of making use of arguments open to challenging their pertinence and validity, the principle of not denying one's own lived experience, and the principle of articulating and applying an explicit method. All this, of course, would not produce any kind of infallible method, but it would certainly help to improve the quality of critical scientific practice, especially in those fields where scientific reflection is needed in order to overcome the effects of ideology, by making explicit what is specifically at stake in a debate to be unfolded. New subsection. The specific finitude of the, quote, labor of the concept, end quote, in the Marxian sciences and the rational infinity of radical philosophical reflection. Once scientific research in the fields concerning the domination of the capitalist mode of production in modern bourgeois societies, that is the, quote, critique of political economy, end quote, which Marx has left to posterity as a, quote, unfinished project, end quote, as well as his, quote, critique of politics, end quote, which he had only begun to sketch, has begun really to grasp its real object by constructing an adequate theoretical object of its further inquiry. It is capable of constructing the specific objects of its research in terms of scientific theory. Footnote. Rojas, 1988, and in a more specifically constructive perspective, Breda, 2018. And footnote, new footnote, the sketches of an important work of reconstruction urgently to be taken up, again provided by Balibar et al., 1979. End footnote. Although this is restricted according to Marx's developed theory to the rather, quote, abstract, end quote, level of the, quote, ideal average, end quote, with the implication that any reapplication of this theory to real historical developments requires an additional effort of research. The examples illustrating the theory in its actual presentation are just the examples, and should not be confused with such a reconstruction of critical historical realities, their underlying antagonisms, and their dynamics. And even this, once achieved, for example, as could be argued with good arguments in Lenin's class analysis of Russia, does not provide a sufficient basis for taking, quote, realistic, end quote, political initiatives. These have to operate not only on the level of the specific history of a country as a historical and geographical singularity, but also, what is even more important, on the level of a given situation, of a concrete conjuncture, in which a way of taking initiatives and realizing actions has to be found in deliberation. This does not as such put brakes on the imagination and the hopes of people active within this reality, nor does it limit the free play of philosophical projections and anticipations, while it certainly distinguishes them from kinds of specifically grasping socio-historical reality, in terms of occasions for action or of possibilities for research, as they are constitutive for political deliberation or for scientific inquiries. Yet this relative liberation from the, quote, principle, end quote, of reality comes at a high cost, at the cost of immediate irrelevancy. Such a liberation may in principle serve as a necessary precondition for building the will to transformative action, but it implies the real danger of, quote, getting lost in transition, end quote, that is, of losing the capacity of ever touching the present realities again, in which historical action must be pertinent to be successful. Philosophy today is not just the Hegelian synthesis of the European philosophical tradition, nor just a return to the unexhausted philosophical alternatives of Brooks, Spinoza, or David Hume. It has constituted itself as a polyphony of reflection opened up by European pioneers such as Kierkegaard, the young Marx, Nietzsche, and Mach, while at the same time becoming aware of the plurality and complexity of human self-reflection existing in non-European traditions. The materialist philosopher has to go beyond the realm of the materialist scientist or politician in taking up the unending labor of answering these strands of reflection. In doing so, they cannot claim to grasp an object outside of this world of practice of human argumentative orientation building. And yet they must be aware of doing a work with real practical impact. The materialist philosopher will ever and again make visible how the free flight of, quote, idealist, end quote, philosophizing is referring back to and intervening in specific historical situations and problems, and is thereby subservient to attempts of looking for an imaginary way out, and yet they cannot expect ever to finish this critical work. Footnote: in doing so, they will fill with life, as Althusser has predicated about, quote, Marxist philosophy, end quote. Quote, there can exist no Marxist philosophy in the classic sense of the word philosophy, and ... The revolution that Marx brought to philosophy consisted in practicing it in a new way, end quote, Althusser, end footnote. This turn to radical philosophy is neither just another fashion in the rapid sequence of philosophical fashions that has marked the real history of philosophy since the end of its European tradition line, nor can it pretend to be the last fully rational philosophy. The full liberation of human societies will also liberate the human capacity for creative self-reflection and creative self-invention, which can certainly be expected to go beyond it, with all the marks it still bears from the history of human submission to domination. New section. Section 5. The disillusioning effect of, quote, finite Marxism, end quote, as a liberation. Get some water. Right. Finite Marxism overcomes the illusion of traditional, quote, historical materialism, end quote, as a formulated general theory of human history by clearly bringing out the singularity and specificity of the objective Marxist critical science, that is, modern bourgeois societies as, and insofar as, dominated by the capitalist mode of production, and, eventually, the modern form of politics. Instead, finite Marxism clarifies how this example of a scientific breakthrough realized by Marx may serve as an inspiration, although not as a model simply to be copied, for further research on human history, societies, and its politics. Footnote: which by the critical publication of the German ideology manuscripts by Leises and Wolff, 2018, in the meantime has lost its traditionally presumed philological basis. There's a book by Terrell Carver and somebody else whose name I can't remember, so I apologize for not giving you your props, but if you listen to this, no one listens to this. But that's like a history, an intellectual history, a political history of the German ideology, which I have not read myself, but I think would be very useful to read. Anyway, end footnote. Finite Marxism recognizes the historical contingency of Marxist philosophy, which has to function as a practice of intellectual orientation in confrontation with different and divergent specific constellations of economic struggles, ideological orientations, and political directions which still today are far from historically uniform, in a global perspective, and therefore can never take an autonomous, quote, systematic, end quote, shape. forced as it is to, quote, take the trains as they go, end quote. Althusser. Finite Marxism recognizes the, quote, unfinished character, end quote, of Marxist scientific theories as an unavoidable effect of their opening the way for further scientific research capable of continuing and deepening its epistemological and scientific breakthroughs, and more specifically, it is attentive to their constitutive characteristic of addressing a, quote, ideal average, end quote, amenable to scientific theoretical reconstruction. Footnote. Marx himself still makes use here of a slightly misleading Hegelian terminology by speaking about the Entwicklung des Begriffs, the unfolding of the concept. His wording may mislead into a properly Hegelian reading of his theoretical work, which is, however, incapable of doing full justice to Marx's epistemological breakthroughs, to a fully scientific treatment of the fields of modern political economy as well as to that of modern politics. It's getting blustery. At the same time, finite Marxism recognizes the existence of structures and processes of domination outside class struggles such as gender domination or international dependency. Its proponents, therefore, are working on developing a culture of dialogue and alliance building between the subjects involved in these substantially different liberation struggles, not in the sense of mutual isolation, but in a perspective of more fully understanding the specificities and the existing or emerging interactions of the struggles against capitalist domination, modern patriarchal subalternization, and imperial exploitation. As an unavoidable consequence of these considerations, finite Marxism therefore addresses the resulting polyphony of Marxists and other voices in the politics of today as a factor of success, and of opening up further possibilities instead of attempting to impose a necessarily violent unification of all of them, while at the same time working upon how to develop productive effects of non-antagonistic, although unavoidable contradictions, in order to make a concerted polyphony of Marxist and other radical voices in politics an effective and sustainable reality. That's the end of the piece. There's an acknowledgement here. I have to thank Darren Rosso for his helpful comments and suggestions. The responsibility for the outcome is, of course, exclusively mine. I'm looking at the references. I'll read the references just for my own purposes. You can call it out. These aren't even notes. These are just like saying the books that I read. I won't read them I won't read the titles if they're in English. If they're not in English. So, Althusser, How to be a Marxist in Philosophy. A. Colari and D.F. Ruscio, 1996 edited volume, Postmodern Materialism and the Future of Marxist Theory, Essays in the Althusserian Tradition. Louis A. Kosser's 1956 The Functions of Social Conflict, something by Ralph Dahrendorf. Gregory Eliot, The Lonely Hour of the Last Instance of Louis-Pierre Althusser, something by Andreas Herberg Rota. Max Horkheimer on the Problem of Truth in Between Philosophy and Social Science, Selected Early Writings, something by a J. Klofach and V. Totsi. A piece by Hans-Jürgen Krzymanski. Sumizo Kuruma's Discussion of Marx's Method, translated from the Marx Lexicon sur Politische Ökonomie, Volume 2, which is available at Marxist.org, apparently. That's good to know. Something by P. Lorenz, 1957. Something by Karl Löwit, 1927. Mao Zedong, 1930. Opposed Book Worship. Mao Zedong, 1937, on practice, the relation between knowledge and practice, between knowing and doing. Something by an H. Martins, 1994. Something by Willy Puller, 1979. Essay, I think it's Stephen A. Resnick and Richard D. Wolff, 2006, New Departures in Marxian Theory. R. Rojas, 1988, something by them, something by Alfred Schmidt from 1977, and something from Carl Schmidt, 1927. Something by Lars Schmidt from 1908, something from Georg Simmel, 1992, 2020, P. Satiris, A Philosophy for Communism, Rethinking Althusser, something by C. Stark, something by Frieder Otto Wolff and D. Valaisis, something else by Wolff, Frieder Otto Wolff, 2004, article, The Limits of Dialectical Presentation is a Key Category of Marxist Theoretical Self-Reflection from Capitalism, Nature, and Socialism. More stuff by Frieder Otto Wolff, not in English. Frieder Otto Wolff article, The Missed Rendezvous of Critical Marxism and Ecological Feminism in Capitalism, Nature, Socialism, Volume 18, Issue 2. And Frieder Otto Wolff, 2009, What Capitalism Is, electronic publication, revised edition in S.R. Ferris, edited volume 2016, Returns of Marxism, Marxist Theory in Times of Crisis. Thanks for listening.